MB 25th, 2025, and I'm watching something unfold that I've been predicting for years. Yet, even I'm struck by how quickly the dominoes are falling. In Geneva, Switzerland, American diplomats are sitting across from Ukrainian officials presenting what they're calling a peace framework. In Abu Dhabi, U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll is in closed-door meetings with Russian representatives. And in European capitals, from London to Berlin, I'm seeing panic. Now, I know what you're thinking. Peace talks are good, right? Diplomacy is how wars end. But here's what caught my attention. Within hours of these meetings, European leaders weren't celebrating, they were scrambling. The UK, France, and Germany hastily drafted what they're calling a counter-proposal. NATO allies who've stood together for 3 years are suddenly fracturing. And Ukraine's President Zelensky, who just days ago was defiant, is now talking about the most difficult moment in his nation's history. Something doesn't add up. When a peace plan causes this much alarm among allies, when it sparks emergency diplomatic sessions and accusations of betrayal, when it makes a leader who's fought for nearly 4 years suddenly sound defeated, that's not just another round of negotiations. That's something far more significant happening. I spent decades studying great power politics, and I can tell you this. What we're witnessing isn't really about peace. It's about power. It's about who has leverage and who doesn't. It's about the stark reality that when great powers clash, smaller nations, no matter how brave or justified, often end up as casualties of forces beyond their control. Let me show you what's really happening behind these diplomatic doors. Because the 28-point plan that Donald Trump's administration just put on the table isn't the compromise it's being sold as. It's a fundamental reshaping of European security that validates everything I've been warning about since 2014. And understanding why requires us to go back to where this all started. Not in February 2022 when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, but much earlier to decisions made in rooms far from Kyiv that set this tragedy in motion. Let me take you back to April 2008. I'm at an academic conference and the news breaks. NATO has just announced at its Bucharest summit that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of the alliance. I remember the moment clearly because I immediately thought this is going to end badly. You see, I'd been studying Russian strategic thinking for years, and I knew, not suspected, but knew that Russian leaders viewed NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. This wasn't speculation. Russian officials from Vladimir Putin to Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had stated it explicitly, repeatedly, publicly when William Burns, who's now CIA director but was then U.S. ambassador to Moscow, sent a memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He wrote something, Al-V, forget Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. Burns wasn't guessing. He'd spent years talking to Russian leaders across the political spectrum, from hardliners to liberals, and he couldn't find a single one who didn't view Ukraine and NATO as a direct challenge to Russian interests. Yet, despite these warnings, despite what I and other realist scholars were saying, the West pushed forward anyway. Fast forward to today, and I'm looking at Trump's 28-point peace proposal, and here's what strikes me. It's essentially an acknowledgement that everything Russia said it wanted all along, it's now getting, not because Russia was morally right, I'm not making a moral argument here, but because Russia had the leverage and the will to use it. And the West either didn't understand or didn't care about the strategic realities. Let me walk you through what this plan actually says because the details matter enormously. First, Ukraine must enshrine in its constitution that it will never join NATO. Not won't join for now, not will delay membership, a permanent constitutional ban. This is exactly what Moscow demanded before the war started. I remember in December 2021, Putin sent letters to both President Biden and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg proposing exactly this arrangement. The U.S. refused to even negotiate. Now, After 3 years of devastating war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and billions in military aid, we're giving Russia what it wanted anyway. Second, Ukraine must cap its military at 600,000 personnel, a reduction of 200,000 to 250,000 soldiers from current levels. I've studied military strategy long enough to tell you what this means in practice. Ukraine would be left unable to defend itself against any future Russian aggression. The Europeans are right to be alarmed by this. Their counter-proposal raises it to 800,000, but even that's inadequate for a country of Ukraine's size facing the threat it faces. Third, and this is where it gets really significant, Ukraine must cede de facto control of Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk to Russia. The plan says Kherson and Zaporizhia will be frozen along the line of contact, which is diplomatic speak for Russia keeping what it's captured. Ukrainian forces must withdraw from parts of Donetsk. They still control to create a demilitarized buffer zone that will be internationally recognized as territory belonging to the Russian Federation. I want you to understand what that last part means. Russia invaded Ukraine, captured roughly 20% of its territory through military force, and this plan would have the international community, including the United States, formally recognize most of these conquests. That's not a peace deal. That's ratifying aggression. Now, I can already hear the objections. Mearheimer, are you saying Ukraine should just surrender? Are you saying Russia was right to invade? No, I'm saying something more complex and, frankly, more uncomfortable. I'm saying this outcome was predictable from the moment NATO decided to bring Ukraine into its orbit, and that the tragedy could have been avoided if Western leaders had understood basic strategic realities. Let me explain what I mean by that, because this is where my analysis diverges sharply from the mainstream narrative you've been hearing for 3 years. The conventional wisdom in the West is that Putin invaded Ukraine because he's an imperialist bent on recreating the Soviet Empire or a greater Russia. Every major Western media outlet, every NATO leader, every speech by President Biden, they all repeat this narrative. Putin is the new Hitler. He wants to conquer all of Ukraine, then move on to the Baltic states, Poland, maybe even reunite the old Warsaw Pact. I've looked at the evidence for this claim extensively, and I can tell you it's not there. Before the 24th of February 2022, I couldn't find a single statement from Putin indicating he wanted to conquer and absorb all of Ukraine. His now famous July 2021 article about Russian-Ukrainian relations, which everyone cites as proof of his imperial ambitions, actually says the opposite. Putin writes, "You want to establish a state of your own. You are welcome. And what Ukraine will be, it is up to its citizens to decide." But let's go beyond what Putin said and look at what Russia actually did. When Russia invaded in February 2022, it deployed at most 190,000 troops. Some estimates put it as low as 100,000. I need you to understand how inadequate that is for conquering a country the size of Ukraine. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and Poland was smaller than Ukraine, they used 1.5 million men. If Russia really intended to conquer and occupy all of Ukraine, why would they use a force 1/10 or 115th the size? Moreover, what happened immediately after the invasion? Russia reached out to Ukraine to start negotiations 4 days after troops crossed the border. Talks began in Belarus. They continued through an Israeli track and then in Istanbul. The available evidence suggests Russia was negotiating seriously, and the framework being discussed, Ukrainian neutrality in exchange for Russian withdrawal from areas around Kyiv, is essentially what we're back to discussing now, except with hundreds of thousands dead and Ukraine in a far weaker position. So if Putin wasn't trying to conquer Ukraine, what was he doing? I believe, and the evidence supports this, that Russia launched what strategists call a preventive war. Putin and his advisors looked at the trajectory of Ukraine becoming a de facto NATO member, armed and trained by the West, and concluded that waiting would only make the threat worse. They decided to act while they still could. Was this justified? That's a moral question I'll leave to others. What I'm telling you is that from a strategic standpoint, This is how great powers behave when they perceive existential threats near their borders. The United States enforced the Monroe Doctrine for over a century, making it clear that no distant great power could form military alliances in our hemisphere. We went to the brink of nuclear war in 1962 when the Soviets tried to put missiles in Cuba. Russia is operating on the exact same logic with Ukraine. Now, let's bring this back to Trump's peace plan and why it matters so much. The plan essentially validates the Russian position. It says implicitly but clearly, NATO expansion was a mistake. Ukraine cannot be in NATO, and Russia's security concerns were legitimate enough that we're willing to accommodate them now after all this bloodshed. This is why I'm watching European reactions so closely. Leaders in London, Paris, and Berlin understand what this means. It means the security architecture they've relied on since World War II is crumbling. It means the United States is no longer willing to be the guarantor of European security in the way it was during the Cold War or even during the unipolar moment of the 1992s and 2000s. Look at what happened at the G20 summit in Johannesburg on November 22nd. A group of 11 countries, UK, Canada, Finland, France, Spain, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Germany, Norway, and Ireland, issued a statement about Trump's plan. They didn't praise it. They said it requires additional work and expressed concern about proposed limitations on Ukraine's armed forces, which would leave Ukraine vulnerable to future attack. That diplomatic language is quite restrained, but I can read between the lines. What they're really saying is this plan abandons Ukraine and sets a terrible precedent for international security. The European counter-proposal that Britain, France, and Germany drafted is even more revealing. They raised the military cap to 800,000. They emphasized that borders must not be changed by force. They insisted on robust security guarantees and a joint security task force that includes Europeans. They demanded that frozen Russian assets stay frozen until Russia compensates Ukraine for damages. In other words, the Europeans are trying to salvage something from this disaster. They're trying to maintain the principle that military aggression shouldn't be rewarded. They're trying to ensure Ukraine isn't left completely defenseless. But here's what concerns me. I don't think it's going to work. Why? Because the fundamental power dynamics haven't changed. Russia has the upper hand militarily. Ukraine is losing ground on the battlefield. The United States under Trump is clearly signaling it wants out of this conflict. And without American backing, European security guarantees are frankly not worth much. Let me show you what's happening on the ground, because this is crucial context for understanding why this peace plan is structured the way it is. I've been following the battlefield reports closely. Russia currently controls about 22% of Ukraine's pre-204 territory. They've made slow but steady gains throughout 2025. Ukrainian commanders report being outnumbered 3-1 in many sectors, sometimes 6-1. Russia has overwhelming advantages in artillery. Various reports put it at anywhere from 3-1 to 1, 0 to 1. They've deployed glide bombs with devastating effectiveness. They've built up their drone capabilities to match or exceed Ukraine's. Most significantly, Ukraine is facing a manpower crisis it cannot solve. Russia has a much larger population and can sustain casualties that Ukraine simply cannot. When I look at the math, and as a scholar, I always look at the math, Ukraine's position is untenable in a prolonged war of attrition. This is why Trump's plan, for all its flaws, reflects a certain cold realism. The people drafting it understand that Ukraine is going to lose more territory if the war continues. They understand that Russia isn't going to accept anything less than Ukrainian neutrality and recognition of its territorial gains. They understand that Europe isn't willing or able to make up for reduced American support. So they've constructed a deal that tries to end the war on terms Russia might accept while giving Ukraine just enough of security guarantee from the United States, economic reconstruction aid, eventual EU membership to make it palatable to Kyiv. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the part that I think reveals the deeper geopolitical shifts at play. The plan isn't just about Ukraine, it's about the United States fundamentally reorienting its foreign policy away from Europe and toward Asia. I've been arguing for years that the shift from unipolarity to multipolarity, which happened around 2017 when China and Russia emerged as great powers, would force the US to make hard choices about where to focus its resources. The rise of China as a peer competitor in East Asia means the United States has a strategic imperative to concentrate its military and diplomatic attention on containing Chinese power. Europe is a secondary theater in this new great power competition. Russia, despite what you hear in Western media, is not a potential regional hegemon in Europe. It doesn't have the military capability to conquer Poland, let alone all of Eastern Europe. Its economy is smaller than Italy's. The Russian military has spent 3 years struggling to take 20% of Ukraine. They're not going to roll through Warsaw and Berlin. China, on the other hand, absolutely could become a regional hegemon in East Asia. It has the economic might, the population, the growing military capability. If China dominates Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere, that fundamentally alters the global balance of power in ways deeply unfavorable to American interests. Trump and his advisors understand this, even if they don't articulate it in these terms. They understand that devoting massive resources to Ukraine, billions in aid, military equipment, diplomatic capital, is a distraction from the more important challenge of China. So they're looking for an exit strategy in Ukraine, even if that means accepting terms that European allies find alarming. This is why I titled this discussion, Ukraine's Forced Surrender. Trump's peace plan betrays NATO allies. The betrayal isn't just of Ukraine, though Ukraine is certainly being asked to swallow a very bitter pill. The betrayal is of the entire post-World War II security architecture in Europe. Now, let me connect all these threads and show you what this really means for the future. What we're witnessing is the end of an era. For roughly 3 decades, from 1992 until 2017, Europe enjoyed unprecedented peace and stability under the American security umbrella. The United States was so dominant that no one could challenge it. NATO expanded, the EU grew, and Europeans could focus on economic integration and social programs rather than defense spending. That world is gone, and Trump's Ukraine peace plan is the obituary. The plan works from a premise that I believe is correct, but that many will find uncomfortable. Russia has won this war in the ways that matter most to Russia. They've prevented Ukraine from joining NATO. They've acquired significant territory. They've demonstrated that they're willing to use military force to defend what they see as vital interests. And they've done so despite massive Western support for Ukraine, which suggests that Western military and economic power has limits. European leaders know this, which is why they're so panicked. If the United States is willing to effectively abandon Ukraine after 3 years of vocal support and billions in aid, what does that mean for other American security commitments? What does it mean for the Baltic states, for Poland, for NATO's eastern flank? The answer, I believe, is that Europeans are going to have to take primary responsibility for their own security. The American pacifier that has kept peace in Europe since 1945 is being withdrawn. Americans don't care about Europe, but because American strategic interests now point elsewhere, this brings me to the question. And I'm sure many of you are asking, is this peace plan good or bad? Should it be accepted or rejected? From a moral standpoint, it's deeply troubling. It rewards Russian aggression. It forces Ukraine to give up territory and people. It sets a precedent that might makes right in international affairs. But from a strategic standpoint, and I'm a strategic analyst, not a moral philosopher, I believe this deal, or something very much like it, is probably inevitable. The alternative is continued war that Ukraine cannot win. More hundreds of thousands of casualties, further destruction of Ukraine's economy and infrastructure, and probably even worse terms down the road when Ukraine's position deteriorates further. I'm not saying Ukraine should be happy about this. I'm saying the tragedy was baked in the moment Western leaders decided in 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO's orbit without thinking through the consequences. Everything since then has been playing out the logic of that initial strategic blunder. The deeper lesson here is about the nature of international politics in a multipolar world. We're returning to an era where geography, military power, and great power competition matter more than international law or liberal values. Russia is demonstrating that a great power willing to use force can change facts on the ground that diplomacy must eventually accommodate. China is watching and learning. This is why I've titled my recent work, Europe's Bleak Future. I don't say that to be provocative or pessimistic. I say it because the combination of American disengagement, Russian assertiveness, and European unpreparedness points toward a more unstable, more dangerous continent. The frozen conflict that's likely to emerge from this peace deal, Ukraine divided Russian and NATO forces facing each other across a militarized line. Deep grievances on all sides is a recipe for future crisis. So where does this leave us? What should we take away from this moment? I believe we're at an inflection point in the post-Cold War order. The decisions made in these negotiations in Geneva, in Abu Dhabi, in European capitals will shape not just Ukraine's future, but the broader trajectory of international politics for the next generation. For Ukraine, the choice is genuinely agonizing. Accept terms that feel like betrayal or continue fighting a war that grows more unwinnable by the day. President Zelensky isn't wrong when he says this is one of the most difficult moments in his nation's history. He's being asked to sign away territory, abandon NATO ambitions, and trust that the West will actually follow through on its promised security guarantees. The same West that promised to protect Ukraine's sovereignty when it gave up nuclear weapons in 1994. For Europe, the wake-up call needs to be deafening. The security environment they've taken for granted for 30 years is gone. They need to dramatically increase defense spending, coordinate their own security policies, and prepare to be the primary guarantors of their own safety. The question is whether they have the political will to do so. For the United States, we need to be honest about what we're doing. If we're going to deprioritize Europe to focus on China, fine. That's a defensible strategic choice. But let's not pretend we're upholding our commitments when we're clearly preparing to scale them back. And let's be aware of the long-term costs of showing allies that American security guarantees have an expiration date. The broader principle I want you to understand is this. In international politics, power matters more than principles. That's not a moral judgment. It's an observation about how the world works. Russia had the power and will to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, and they used that power. The West had the principles, but not the power or will to stop them. The result is the peace plan we're seeing now. I know many of you will find this analysis pessimistic or even defaced, but I believe in facing reality squarely. The Ukraine war was provoked by Western policies that ignored basic strategic realities. It's ending with a deal that reflects the distribution of power, not the justice of the cause, and it's setting precedents that will shape how great powers interact and how smaller states get caught between them for years to come. The key question going forward is whether we learn from this tragedy. Can Western leaders develop more realistic assessments of what's achievable in international politics? Can they resist the temptation to make commitments they can't keep? Can they understand that sometimes the morally satisfying policy is strategically disastrous? I'm not optimistic, but I'm a scholar, not a fortune teller. What I can tell you is that if we don't learn these lessons, we're likely to repeat these mistakes, and next time the stakes might be even higher. The tragedy of Ukraine is that it was avoidable. Brave people have fought and died for a cause that their leaders should have known they couldn't win. Not because Ukrainians aren't courageous or determined, but because the great power dynamics were fundamentally unfavorable. That's the cold logic of international politics that I've spent my career studying, and it's playing out exactly as realist theory would predict. I wish I could tell you a more hopeful story. I wish I could say that justice will prevail, that the international community will stand firm on principles, that Ukraine will get everything it deserves. But I've been watching international politics too long to believe in fairy tales. What I can tell you is this: understanding these dynamics, seeing clearly how power works in the international system, and recognizing when idealism needs to be tempered with realism. These are crucial skills for navigating the world we actually live in, not the world we wish existed. The peace plan betrays NATO allies and forces Ukraine into a corner. But the deeper betrayal happened years ago when Western leaders made promises they couldn't keep and set in motion events they couldn't control. Now we're all living with the consequences. That's the harsh truth about international politics.